It is Tuesday, March the 22nd, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So after the daily declaration for spiritual warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch, and the second part of Chapter 2, called Union Fist, of the book Shadowbosses. All that and more when I come back. Thank you. And now the daily declaration for spiritual warfare for March 22nd. You will bruise Satan under your feet. My child, do not fear Satan and his demonic angels, for I have already cursed him and stripped him of all his power for his deception in the garden. I've given to you the victory over all his important attacks against you. If you fully obey me and carefully follow all my commands, I will set you high above all nations on the earth, far above all principality and power and might and dominion, and every name that is named. I will open the heavens, the storehouse of my bounty, to send rain on your land in season, and to bless all the work of your hands. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 13, Romans chapter 16, verses 19 through 20, and Malachi chapter 4, verse 3. Prayer declaration. Lord, remove Satan's seat from my region, city, and nation. The Son of Righteousness has arisen with healing in his wings, and in his power I shall trample the wicked, and they shall be ashes under the soles of my feet. You have enlarged my path under me, so my feet will not slip. My enemies have fallen under my feet. Amen. And that was the daily declaration for March 22nd. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious and realistic. He is the person that understands that culture is the foundation for politics. He acknowledges a benevolent universe. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you, thank you. What are the tactics in support of the strategy to rid America of socialist influence? The long-term tactics are to be a true conservative, talk like a conservative, act like a conservative, dress like a conservative, and think like a conservative. The short-term tactics are rhetorical. True conservatives need to win all of the arguments. That means don't prove a negative. Don't take their word for it. Don't be neutral, and ask plenty of questions. Thank you, thank you. What is the true conservative strategy for defeating socialists in this country? Socialists must be driven from positions of power, and since it is lefty counterculture that provides the foundation for their political success, true conservatives must resist left-wing counterculture and promote normal American culture. By changing our culture, we will change our politics. And by changing the culture, we mean you need to get married, have a family, and raise your children. Thank you. Thank you. What are the true conservative political priorities? Number 1, the abolition of abortion throughout the land. Number 2, to make nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons obsolete. Number 3, the immediate decertification of all public employee unions. Number 4, the immediate assignment of criminal and civil liabilities to all government regulators. Number 5, the immediate repeal of the so-called Patriot Act. Number 6, the immediate repeal of all so-called emergency dictator laws. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. Probability is not a mere computation of odds on the dice or more complicated variants. It is the acceptance of the lack of certainty in our knowledge and the development of methods for dealing with our ignorance. Nassim Taleb. Individuals have an ability to deal with what they do not know more proficiently than does a disinterested third party acting on behalf of a whole population. The skin in the game of an individual gives different motives, different processes, and a different awareness to what they do not know in any given situation. In this sense, the knowledge problem is compounded far beyond how the term is generally used. The knowledge problem is not just that a collective cannot know what individuals do know in their local and specific context. It is further that individuals are better equipped to process and mitigate the risk of what can't be known than a collective actor ever could be. And that was There's No Free Lunch. And now part 2 of chapter 2 from the book Shadowbosses, and it's called Memphis Blues Again. This was not the end of the story of union coercion in Memphis. Within a few short years, both the firefighters and police workers were unionized. Soon after, they struck. The story of these strikes shows us the true danger of unionizing critical public safety workers. Once organized, they can and will strike, even if striking is illegal. And when public safety workers go on strike, citizens are truly left unprotected. In July 1978, the local affiliate of the International Association of Firefighters ordered more than 1,400 firefighters to go out on strike. This union wasn't aiming for decent pay or better working conditions with this strike. Not even close. This strike was over shift differential, the fact that firefighters received less additional pay for working less desirable shifts than other city employees received. Faced with striking firefighters, the new mayor, J. Wyeth Chandler, cobbled together a force of 150 substitute firefighters made up of supervisors, National Guard troops, the few firefighters who did not go on strike, and National Park Service firefighters. Many members of the skeleton crew were not even familiar with the streets in the city of Memphis. From the beginning, the strike was marked by widespread violence, vandalism, and other misconduct. Within 24 hours of the strike, tire slashing, headlight smashing, engine tampering, and destruction of medical equipment put most of the fire department's ambulances out of operation. Using vandalism, Union strikers took away the tools that the substitute firefighters would need to keep the population safe. What better way to pressure a city than put its population in real danger of being without essential safety services? On the first weekend of the strike, 3 times as many fires were reported as normal, sketching the skeleton crew very thin. At the sites of some of the blazes, Union militants physically blocked their substitutes from getting to the fires, and so Memphis burned. In just 2 days, fires caused an estimated $3 million in damage to the city. The Memphis police director reported that Union agents were responsible for setting 90 to 95% of the fires. That's actual arson on the part of the firefighters' union. The police director exclaimed, "Last night was one of the most unreal scenes I've ever seen. It was like a World War II newsreel." After 3 days, the city firefighters returned to work, complying with a court injunction against the strike. But Memphians barely had a time to catch their breath before the next illegal public safety strike. Less than 1 week later, police went out on strike. What were they aiming for? They wanted an arbitration clause added to their contract so that future disputes between police and the government employers would be sent to a neutral arbiter. Once again, violence and intimidation were the order of the day. Officers who returned to work heard from anonymous phone callers threatening to make your families pay, or take it out on your wife and kids, and to teach you a lesson. Union members trashed 25 police vehicles, 3 fire trucks, and blew up a tear gas bomb in the county administrative building, all in pursuit of that all-important arbitration clause. While this strike raged, the firefighters rejected the tentative contract that they negotiated the previous month and went out on a second illegal strike. Now Memphis had police and firefighters both out on strike at the same time, creating a public service emergency. To add to the crisis, Memphis sanitation and teachers' union bosses launched sympathy strikes in support of the police and fire unions. Within 8 days, Memphis was brought to its knees. The mayor was forced to cut a deal with these various government employee unions, and that deal included a provision giving all the illegal strikers amnesty, except for those who had actually been caught committing felonies. That naturally was a small number since the police were striking. So who would arrest the felons? More unions, more strikes. Rather than avoiding strife, unionizing our essential public safety workers actually puts our government in the position of being unable to protect our public safety in the case of a strike. Breakdown in government services is possible only when government workers are unionized. Strikes of public safety workers actually create emergency situations, causing citizens to panic, and citizens' fears make public safety worker strikes both short and enormously effective. And with greater unionization of government public safety workers, strikes increased dramatically. In New York City, where unions were king, the unions were no kinder to their subjects. Illegal strikes and violence were the order of the day. On July 1st, 1975, sanitation workers staged a wildcat strike, letting garbage pile up in the city in the heat of the summer, just as Jerry Werft had advised for a successful garbage strike. During the strike, police officers marched on City Hall, blocking access ramps to the Brooklyn Bridge and carrying signs that read, "Cops out, crime in," and "Burden City, burn." Even the liberal New York Times editors admitted last week's illegal sanitation strike was the end product of 3 decades in which one New York mayor after another systematically fostered the growth of centralized union power. Instead of bringing cooperation and labor peace, growing union power resulted in greater strike activity. In Pomona, California in 1975, police officers went on strike and then proceeded to vandalize cop cars and stop volunteers from assuming police duties. "I am ashamed of this kind of activity on the part of policemen," said a police captain there. "The citizens feel the officers have abandoned them, and they have." That same year, policemen went on strike in San Francisco. When the mayor threatened to fire them, the officers firebombed his home. Firefighters in Dayton, Ohio let fires burn out of control during their strike in 1977. Same thing happened in St. Louis that year. From the late 1960s to the early 80s, sanitation, public safety, and public hospital strikes hit not just Memphis, New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, but also Kansas City, St. Louis, Huntsville, and many other American cities, large and small. Time and again, homes and businesses were destroyed and lives were jeopardized as a consequence of government employee union strikes, most of them illegal. As Al Shanker, the legendary head of the American Federation of Teachers, explained, one of the greatest reasons for the effectiveness of public employees' strike is the fact that it is illegal. He was making the point that illegal strikes inflict harm on cities and frighten residents, which make these strikes even more successful than legal strikes. And calling an illegal strike rarely hurts the union or its members. After illegal strikes, unions have almost always been able to negotiate an amnesty for the illegal strikers as part of the strike settlement agreement. Americans who live in towns and cities that have given power over to their public safety workers to the government employee unions can never again truly rely on those workers to protect their safety. Union objectives come first, even when life and property are at stake. It's the short version of that is conflict of interest. Okay? Conflict of interest is inherent in public employee unions. That's why they have to go. That's the reason they've got to go. Once the union toughs like Jerry Worf got their feet wedged in the government door, they had no qualms about breaking into the house, stealing the silverware, and then setting the structure ablaze. Back in a minute. Thank you. More strikes, more violence. Strikes by public safety workers charged with protecting our citizens are very different from strikes by factory workers. In the private sector, strikes by workers put economic pressure on the owners of a business. The owners will seek to end the strike before it becomes too costly for the business or drives too many of the business's customers to its competitors. In contrast, strikes by public sector workers are not economic, but rather undermine the whole role of government to protect its citizens. As labor policy analysts Armand and Thomas noted, when strikes involved employees charged with protection of public safety, they are inherently violent. They continue, denial of protection is itself a form of violence. The point is that the job of the fireman or policeman is to protect citizens, and failing to do this job is itself a form of extortion. Beyond merely not performing their duties, strikes of union workers have often used outright violence as a tactic. According to the National Institute for Labor Relations Research, union members have committed more than 10,000 incidents of union-related violence that were actually reported by the media since 1975, usually in the context of a strike. These violent incidents include vandalism, assault, battery, and even murder. The actual number of incidents may be 10 times greater or even 100 times greater than these reported incidents. The media tends to ignore such violence. As the director of the NILRR project, Stanley Greer concluded the past quarter century has witnessed an enormous amount of union-related violence, which can hardly be dismissed as spontaneous or uncoordinated. Of these media-reported violent incidents, no legal action at all was taken in almost 4 out of 5 of these cases, and a paltry 3% of these violent incidents resulted in convictions, even though there are usually plenty of witnesses in cases like these. One reason is that law actually discourages prosecution of union officials and members for violence committed particularly during strikes. Legal violence. You remember the story at the beginning of the chapter in which the union officials and members allegedly committed vandalism, threatened workers, and stabbed a company official to get them to sign agreements with the union? That case is still pending in federal court because the union claims that even if all the allegations of wrongdoing and violence are true, the union bosses and members are protected from prosecution under federal law. In discussing the case, Mark Mix, president of the National Right to Work Committee, explains, time and again, federal prosecutors have amassed extensive evidence that big labor bosses have orchestrated, authorized, and or ratified violence, vandalism, and threats. He continues, nevertheless, because of the pro-union violence loophole, extortion prosecutions of the implicated union officials ultimately fail or never even get off the ground. How could that possibly be true? Because the Supreme Court has essentially legitimized union violence in the furtherance of union objectives. In 1973, the Supreme Court ruled in U.S. v. Edmonds that if union officials or members commit violence, they can't be prosecuted under federal extortion laws as long as they were doing the violence in pursuit of a legitimate union aim, like striking for higher wages. The Supreme Court case involved several striking electrical workers who allegedly fired high-powered rifles at 3 utility company transformers, drained oil from a transformer, and blew up a substation. The court decided that their acts were not wrongful use of violence because they were in furtherance of a legitimate union goal. These goals being improving the outcome of the strike. Essentially, this decision means that union bosses and members aren't treated like everyone else when it comes to intimidation and violence. Only little people are prosecuted for violence. Former Attorney General Edwin Meese III said federal law, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, in effect permits union officials alone among corporate or associational officers in the United States to use violence and threats of violence to life and property to achieve their goals. It's just another way that unions and union officials get special treatment under the law that is not available for regular Americans. If you burn down your office building on behalf of your boss, so he will get insurance money, both you and your boss will be prosecuted. If you burn down an office building on behalf of your union during a strike, no one will likely be prosecuted. Although some violent crimes committed by union members during strikes can be prosecuted under state law, the Edmunds decision itself encourages states and localities to drop prosecutions. The unions love this end justifies the means logic. After all, stronger federal prosecution of union crime might have a chilling effect on union violence during strikes, which might make unions less effective in achieving their goals. And we certainly wouldn't want that. How many times has this law actually prevented union officials and members from facing prosecution? No one knows. We do know that at least 203 Americans have been murdered and at least 5,869 Americans have been injured in union-related violence since 1975. These are just the cases that are reported on and classified as union violence by the press, which is not always able and willing to cover these incidents. Many states have similar laws providing exceptions to their extortion laws for union officials and members. Why? Because the state laws follow model legal codes that include this exception, which are written by pro-union law professors and leaders of the American Bar Association. To close this loophole in federal law, Congressman Paul Brown reintroduced the Freedom from Union Violence Act in 2012, which Congressman Joe Wilson and others introduced in earlier sessions of Congress. How many Democrats have ever corresponded or co-sponsored a Freedom from Union Violence bill? You guessed it, absolutely zero. If Democrats won't oppose union violence, they won't oppose unions on anything, especially not union coercion and intimidation. Back in a minute. Q. Thuggery. Unions also use extreme intimidation tactics to force their opponents to back down. Service Employees International unions have allegedly used brutal intimidation tactics in several campaigns to unionize corporate workplaces. While these examples involve SEIU's private sector organization efforts, they show the extreme intimidation tactics that are allegedly in the union's playbook and that unions could apply in government contexts as well. One of the most egregious alleged cases of union pressure tactics involved SEIU's campaign against the multinational food services company Sodexo, whose workers SEIU is seeking to unionize. If the employer permits it to do so, a union can be certified as the representative of workers in a business by simply collecting cards from workers without conducting a secret ballot election. SEIU demanded that Sodexo let it unionize the company's workers using card check, but the company refused. So the union allegedly retaliated by launching a negative public relations campaign against Sodexo, claiming food safety and other violations against the company. Sodexo fought back in court with a lawsuit against SEIU under the Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. Sodexo issued a press release explaining the company filed the lawsuit seeking to halt SEIU's extortionate threats and barrage of unlawful tactics. In this press release, Sodexo alleges that the union engaged in blackmail, vandalism, trespass, harassment, and lobbying law violations designed to steer business away from Sodexo USA and harm the company. In the suit itself, Sodexo accuses SEIU of numerous acts of threatening behavior, intimidation, and property destruction, some so extreme as to be comical. For example, in its legal complaint, Sodexo accused the SEIU of using false pretenses to infiltrate a prestigious medical conference catered by Sodexo, and once inside, throwing plastic roaches into the food being served at the conference. Sodexo also alleges in its complaint that the SEIU attempted to instill fear and disgust in hospital patients and their loved ones by passing out patient surveys asking, without a shred of factual justification, whether patients had encountered bugs, rat droppings, mold, or flies in the food they were served by Sodexo employees. Pretty nasty allegations indeed. Faced with a RICO lawsuit, SEIU ended its public campaign against Sodexo. The case settled out of court, but not before the lawsuit exposed an SEIU manual entitled Pressuring the Employer, which showed SEIU's own coercive tactics honed in disputes with private companies. This corporate campaign playbook describes in detail its preferred tactics for harassing, intimidating, smearing, and psychologically and financially punishing employers that are unwilling to yield to its extortionate demands, alleged Sodexo in its complaint in the case. The manual begins, "It's not enough to be right, you need might as well." In an expose in the Washington Times, labor law analyst Vincent Vernuccio reported that the SEIU manual suggests local unions use community groups to damage an employee's public image and ties with community leaders and organizations. He notes that the manual also suggests unions attack company leaders personally in order to get decision makers to take the union's side in a dispute or to allow the union to organize workers in a company under more favorable conditions. SEIU allegedly put intimidation tactics into practice in another matter by driving 14 busloads of protesters to the residential neighborhood of the Deputy General Counsel of Bank of America and protesting on his lawn with bullhorns. The union protesters were said to have scared the daylights out of neighbors and the counsel's teenage son, who was home alone. Fortune's Washington bureau chief, Nina Easton, who happened to live next door and witnessed the 500-person protest on the quiet suburban street, concluded intimidation was the whole point of this exercise. The union manual also explains that union representatives can use a legal form of blackmail against managers to get them to change their positions on union issues. The union manual clarifies it may be a violation of blackmail and extortion laws to threaten management officials with the release of dirt about them if they don't settle a contract. But, as the manual points out, there's no law against union members who are angry at their employer deciding to uncover and publicize factual information about individual managers. In other words, extreme pressure tactics and personal revelations are union-prescribed techniques for getting opponents to give in to union demands. Conclusion. With the unions now representing more government workers than private workers, unions generally use political persuasion to get what they want. Simply buying cooperation from politicians is much easier for the unions than using strikes, violence, and intimidation, and far better from a public relations perspective. But don't think for a second that union coercion and violence is a thing of the past. Just because unions may now represent far more white-collar workers than blue-collar workers, far more postal workers and teachers than burly steel workers and truckers, doesn't mean that violence and coercion aren't still front and center in the union's playbook. Today's shadow bosses may dine at the White House and be more refined and polished than union bosses of old, but they still use strikes and threats of strikes by our nation's public safety workers to put communities at risk and win concessions from them. They still use extreme pressure and blackmail-like tactics to get politicians and corporate leaders to decide their way. Also, outright union violence is still with us and is about 3 times more prevalent in union-controlled states than in less union-controlled right-to-work states. Funny how this type of violence doesn't bother liberals, who are usually so focused on tolerance and peace. Union advocate Robert Reich, who was President Clinton's Secretary of Labor, admits to maintain themselves, unions have got to have some ability to strap their members to the mast. The only way unions can exercise countervailing power is to hold their members' feet to the fire. In other words, a union supporter explains that sometimes unions need to exercise coercion over their own members to achieve union objectives. In nearly every chapter of this book, we will see how unions will use coercion and violence in order to achieve their objectives. But next, let's see how government employee unions use dues money to buy the government that is supposed to represent us all. And that was the end, the second part, and the end of Chapter 2 of the book Shadowbosses. Thank you, thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that is spiritual. He's the man that seeks consensus. He's subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He is informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He is impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He is deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He is skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you, thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to tune in to the John and Ken Show, which is an excellent example of how true conservatives communicate. It's a radio show that's on KFI AM 640 from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 6 o'clock in the evening, Monday through Friday. And that's Pacific time. So that's an excellent show to listen to. And other than that, until next time, remember to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.